Hi there, my name is Karen from Relatedness Consulting, and this is one of our videos in our neuroscience and psychology series aimed at helping leaders and change agents to apply the latest learning to facilitating and leading effective and resourceful organizations. Today, this video is going to focus on the learning from neuroscience as applied to leading people in ways that helps them to be at their best and most resourceful. To do this, we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding how our brains and bodies respond to threat in the modern world. And we're going to introduce you to a model called SCARF, which is a way of thinking about the different things that trigger us into either being at our best or being in a more threatened and defensive state. And we're going to finish the video looking at some practical tips that leaders and change agents can deploy to increase the resourcefulness of their organizations. The first thing we need to do is introduce ourselves to our amygdala. These are little organs that are part of our brain, and they're like scanners, I suppose, is one way of thinking about it. They are constantly looking around in the world. They're sensing and picking up information that's coming at us through our bodies and our senses, and they're trying to work out the answer to a very simple question. Am I safe or am I not safe? And that is pretty much their only job. And they then will trigger a whole series of responses that runs right through our entire bodies, which actually give our bodies the capacity to respond to threat when it is perceived. So these little sensors in our brains are constantly looking for that information, and when they don't find threat information, they allow us to stay in a highly resourceful state. And when we're in this resourceful state, the sort of hippocampus and prefrontal cortex in the brain are kind of running the show emotionally and mentally, and we have all sorts of lovely hormones that are dominant in our bodies at that time. So things like oxytocin and dopamine, which we'll come back to later in terms of how they affect our thinking and working capacities. But when we're in this resourceful state, our bodies are using long, slow neural pathways, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So our nervous systems are broken down into three main types. We have the motor nerves, which drive muscle action. We have the sensory nerves, which provide and relay information such as sight and hearing. And we have the autonomic system. And in fact, though, there are two of them. There are sort of two parallel systems. And the one that is in play when we are in this resourceful, non-threatened state is called the parasympathetic system. And this system really helps our whole body to function in a really sustainable and creative way. And we also feel much better about ourselves and each other, and we're capable of trusting and loving each other in this sort of state. However, if the amygdala pick up a threat, then it's kind of a bit like flicking a switch, and the other autonomic nervous system kicks in, which is called the sympathetic system. Its physical structure is very short, fast neural pathways, and it actually changes our hormone balance completely. Very quickly, our bodies are flooded with things like adrenaline and cortisol, which have a very different effect on our bodies, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And we feel very different things when we're in this sort of state. So let's explore that a little bit further and have a bit more in depth about what's actually going on in the brain and the body and in our social interactions when we're in one or the other of these two states. So let's just imagine for a moment that the amygdala has picked up some kind of threat. Now, in pre-modern man, that might have been a wild animal walking into our village, threatening people around us and ourselves, or it could be any number of things, but usually there was a very strong physical threat at the time when these systems evolved in our brains. And so as our bodies are sensing these things going on around us, and they pick up a threat, because the amygdala is constantly asking, as I said, am I safe? Am I not safe? A threat is detected, and immediately the system sends out signals to jam all the other systems. So when we're threatened and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and cortisol and adrenaline starts flooding our bodies, it has a similar effect to us as a paper jam does to a printer. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you really have got some very important stuff to get printed on the printer, but a great big wodge of paper has managed to entangle itself completely around all of the rollers. And the rollers cannot go forward and they cannot go backwards, and you are certainly not printing any complex documents on that printer at this moment. And that's a bit like what happens when our threat receptors kick in. All of the lovely resourceful systems that run on the long, slow neural pathways are just jammed to stop them working. We're going to talk a bit in a moment about the implication that has for things like collaboration and inventiveness, but you may already begin to start to imagine what that might be like. So why does it do this? Why would our body have evolved the capacity to block our own resourcefulness? Well, let's have a think about what's actually going on. So the reason that we block resourcefulness is because resourcefulness is all about the long term, and it's all about sustainable health requirements and also sustainable solution finding. But of course, if a lion has jumped through the window, just jumped through the window of your hotel bedroom, you don't really want to stop and spend the next 5 minutes having a creative brainstorm with yourself about whether this particular lion happens to be friendly or not. You just need to react extremely fast. And your body has evolved the mechanism to do that. Some people call this the fight, flight, freeze phenomenon. There's actually 5 major phenomena of this kind that human beings resort to in a threatened state. Fight, flight and freeze are fairly obvious and most people are aware of them, but flock and fawn might be new to some people. So when we flock, we basically unconsciously reject people who are different to us, and we clump together with people who we feel super comfortable with, and we form gangs, and we're very likely then to attack people who are not like us from the position of that gang, and that is a flocking mechanism. And a fawning mechanism is a very human type of threatened behaviour, which is to look around, and again, it's all unconscious, is to find somebody who is not affected by the threat because they're very powerful or they're very physically strong or something, depending on the threat, and to attach ourselves in a very political and kind of weaselly way to that person, to basically encourage them to protect us. So those are the different reactions and how they kind of happen for us. But what's really interesting is what's actually going on in the body and the mind and the social interactions when we're working in this state. So we need to understand that when we're in this fight-flight mode, we have absolutely no need of things that sustain our long-term health. So things like making sure our heart is working properly, that we're digesting our food properly, that our immune system is protecting us properly, that we are sexually functioning and able to produce the next generation. All of these things are not important for the next 5 minutes, where you will either live or you will die. And so the body changes the way it privileges the systems that are required for health, and will start to immediately starve resources, including oxygen, from parts of the body that are only really need to be sustained properly if you're going to live a long and happy life. So people who experience themselves in a threatened state a lot of the time are susceptible to some very serious health risks. So things like if your immune system is very low, because it's not being sustained because you're constantly in a threatened state, then you will likely start to realize that, because you might start to suffer from things like cold sores more often than not. If you happen to have the herpes simplex virus in your lips, then they will bubble up more often. You will start to have difficulty digesting food properly, and so you might have increased risk of things like irritable bowel or other digestive problems. The kind of hormones that are coursing around your body at this stage are sleep preventative, which means that basically you might start having difficulty sleeping. And if you have difficulty sleeping, all the latest research suggests that sleep deprivation is highly correlated and probably causal with things like less capacity to regulate weight. So you're more likely to become overweight, leading to obesity. You're more likely to have heart disease. As this kind of threat reaction kicks in, what you might notice in your body at that moment is things like your mouth drying up. That's very common. So if people feel threatened by having to give a presentation in public, they often will report having a dry mouth and not being able to get the words out, wanting to drink, coughing and getting a frog in their throat. That's all part of the physical reaction that's going on. Our pupils dilate and we feel much more anxious. So all in all, while this mechanism has helped us to fight off our lion in the next 5 minutes, if we sustain this kind of physical state for any length of time, we're likely to do ourselves significant damage. What's also interesting is what it's doing to the brain and the capacity to think. Again, if we are going to have to fight this lion for the next 5 minutes, and we can't really think about that, because if we stop to think about it, by the time we've actually worked out a rational and somewhat logical, well thought through reaction to the problem, we're probably already cat food. So this jamming mechanism actually interrupts the capacity of the brain to think. And it deploys unconscious rules and autopilots. So in the modern world, given that most of us are not attacked by lions on a regular basis, when this threat kicks in, it's mostly related to something to do with our work or our home life. And when that happens, the very thing we might need to be able to find creative solutions and to transform our reaction to perhaps a different situation is being undermined completely by this. And we become more and more capable of only doing those things that we already know how to do. So when you see people around you at work who talk transformation, but in their anxiety keep running around doing exactly what they've always done, this is probably what's going on for them. And finally, it's important to understand what goes on socially when we're in this state. So again, in our modern world, most of the time we're threatened in a situation where collaboration and being able to get the help of others and to offer our help to others is nearly always the right answer. But if we actually allow ourselves to fall into this fight-flight situation, then we're actually less likely to collaborate. We're less likely to share. We're less likely to sacrifice our own selves for the sake of the team or to operate in a generous fashion. And that's because in those moments of threat, we're much more likely to blame others, reject difference and novelty and diversity, grab onto what we know and look after number one. So now that you've seen some of the physical, social and emotional and intellectual problems associated with being in a threatened state when the sympathetic nervous system is in charge and your body is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, it makes it much clearer, I hope, why leaders and change agents should really need to try to work out how, even in conditions of great difficulty in their organisations, why we would want to try to avoid triggering the amygdala into what's sometimes called the amygdala hijack, which is when this threatened state takes over. So let's have a think for a moment about what's going on when we're resourceful, and then I'm going to move us on into looking at the sort of things that actually trigger the hijack in the modern world. So as you'd expect, when we're not threatened, when we're in our resourceful state, which is sometimes called the rest, digest and restore state in the physical body, all the opposite things that I've just describing are in charge. So our oxygen and other vital resources are being directed towards sustainable central organs, while our muscles are being maintained. They're not taut and alert and flooded with oxygen. And our immunity and our health and digestive and sexual function is all being looked after in a proper way. Our full mental capacity is in a relaxed creative state, so we haven't got that paper jam in our system blocking everything from slowing down. So we're capable of slow thinking, of pausing, of zooming out or testing our assumptions, looking at things from different points of view. We are capable of unlearning some unhelpful routines that have made up part of our past. And we can interrupt our own desires and autopilot a little bit more and be able to think through what is helpful and to innovate new responses. And from a social point of view, we're much more open to enjoying diversity and novelty. And we will collaborate with much more generosity because we are much more focused on the good of the team or the tribe rather than looking after number one. And this is largely driven by the presence in our system of what some neuroscientists have called the trust hormone or the morality chemical, which is oxytocin. And when we're producing a lot of oxytocin in our system, we are capable of feeling and acting in a much more moral, ethical and trusting and trustworthy way with other people. So now that you've understood a little bit more about the actual physicality of threat and resourcefulness, and this idea of the hijack and whether our bodies are operating in one of these two operating systems. Now I'm going to explore with you some of the modern world's triggers and threats that can cause us to have that hijack and not be at our best. So to do this, I'm going to use a model called SCARF. And that stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness. And this model was created in around about 2008 by a guy called Dr. David Rock. Others as well were involved in this. It's from the Neuroscience Institute. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through each of these, giving you examples of how in the modern world these particular triggers are threatened and what can happen as a result of that. So let's start with status and have a think about why status would be a threat trigger for human beings. So the first thing to understand about our status needs is that it is absolutely fundamental to our participation in communal societies. The human being doesn't really survive very well on its own, so we really have evolved to become highly social creatures living in rather large groups. Now, to basically ease the process of our communing and making society together, we have, like many mammals actually, we have evolved the capacity to understand relative status in any group that we're part of, and we're scanning for this constantly. We're asking ourselves, what is my position here in relative terms to the others in whatever group I am in? And this makes sense if you think about, again, pre-modern mankind, because a high status individual in any group would have first access to resources. They might get at the food first. They may be able to pick the best mates. So actually there was a really strong evolution argument for being concerned about one's status. And that still lives with us now. And in fact, there's been lots of research done on this, and people who experience themselves as high status in any group that they participate in are actually likely to have better health and to live longer. We're not entirely sure how that works beyond simply the access to better health care or better nutrition. But it does seem that there is also some kind of protective effect physically in the body to experiencing oneself as very high status. And part of that might be the production of dopamine. So when, for example, we're given a little stroke, if you like, a mental or emotional stroke by somebody that lifts our status in a group, our body produces dopamine, our brain produces dopamine, which is a wonderful hormone and gives us a lovely, warm, self-esteem kind of feeling. Dopamine is also produced by eating chocolate, by the way, which is one of the reasons why people eat chocolate sometimes to comfort themselves, because it makes us feel better. So if we think about the modern organisational world, there's actually lots and lots of ways which inadvertently we cause people pain in the status department. And we can really kind of create rather nasty experiences which reduce people's experience of status. Now, the obvious one is downgrading, somebody literally downgrading them, but that's actually a fairly rare occurrence in modern organisational life. What is actually much more common is, for example, being left out. So being missed off an invitation to an important meeting, or being excluded deliberately because you don't have the right grade to be in the room. And these kinds of experiences are really diminishing in terms of status. Even things like adding a new layer in the organisation above somebody, whilst on paper it does nothing to their grade, salary, or even job description. The unconscious assessment that's going on of status will tell that person that they've been downgraded. And often that's because adding a new layer in, for example, might actually interrupt their access to people of more power. Or it might mean that they have less resources than they had before because they have to ask for authorization in a different way. Being judged or evaluated by another person is inherently a status reducer. The very fact that another adult human being believes themselves to be in a position to judge you or evaluate you or score you in some way automatically, if you think about it, puts them one up and you one down. Losing in competition is an obvious one, having your privileges withdrawn. But even giving somebody feedback or advice has the effect of reducing their status experience. In fact, neuroscientists have modeled some of this by putting people in brain scanners and then modeling environments where they're given a piece of feedback about themselves. And it has about the same kind of effect on the brain as somebody suddenly jumping out of a dark alley and pouncing on you from behind. That's the kind of hijack effect that occurs when somebody says to you, "Do you mind if I give you some feedback?" So we have to be really careful about some of these things because they do have an impact. It doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't do these things some of the time, but we need to be aware of it. So let's think about the second letter in our SCARF alphabet, which is around certainty. So we feel a very strong affinity with certainty as human beings for a number of reasons. We like to feel we have a handle on what's going on in the world. But actually, even at a subconscious level or an unconscious level, our brains crave pattern and predictability. And part of that is because our brains are energetically very hungry. They consume about 20% of our calorific intake on a daily basis because they're kind of pure electricity if you think about it. And so again, we have evolved the capacity to save on vital calorie expenditure by using autopilots and routines, which we don't have to think very hard about. We learn something, we practice it, and a bit like driving a car, we start off incompetent and we gradually become unconsciously competent, and we can do most of it without actually having to think about what we're doing in a really conscious way. So the brain is basically seeking out patterns so that when it finds patterns in the world, it can use those patterns to predict causal activity in relationships. And when it can predict that, it can use autopilot routines to respond to them. When the brain perceives ambiguity or a breakdown of pattern, it has a sort of error message kind of effect on the brain, and suddenly all sorts of things start kicking in that make us work a lot harder. Now, uncertainty can trigger a very positive response, and some people seem to be more prone to that than others. So uncertainty can trigger creativity, but only if a whole heap of the other SCARF needs are being so well met that the body and the brain can cope with the levels of uncertainty. And we'll see what some of the other ones are in a moment. So if we think about what might trigger a certainty threat in the modern world, there are all sorts of things that as leaders we can do inadvertently without realizing and trigger a certainty threat in others. So when we let people down, or when we don't tell the whole truth about something, the minute somebody finds out that that has happened, their certainty structures crumble in relation to you and potentially in relation to other things around you. So that's a big certainty trigger. Now, obviously, job insecurity or risk is bound to be a trigger in this area. It's an existential threat. Interestingly, if your workplace is dominated by lists of actions and issues, and the only thing that gets measured is actions, and the only thing that gets talked about is actions, then you're likely to have the potential environment where certainty triggers will unconsciously be going off all the time. Because one of the ways that we understand certainty as human beings is a sense of purpose or vision. So leaders who focus only on the metrics of action and and don't spend time casting forward stories of vision or purpose are more likely to have an uncertain workforce. And it makes sense really to think that secret decisions and things like sudden disappearances of somebody from the workforce without any real explanation, leaders withdrawing and hiding behind closed doors when things get tricky, and saying one thing and doing another. I mean, all of these are, you can imagine, bound to be triggers for certainty. So now we've reached the A, autonomy. And autonomy is slightly different to status, whereas status is my relative position in the pecking order of my community. Autonomy is all about the sensation of having choice and control over oneself and the world in which one is operating. So when we feel like we're self-determining, that's a really wonderful feeling for most people, and it will feed this sort of sense of autonomy. Now, in reality, none of us are actually autonomous. We are caught in a web of relationships, and none of us are free entirely to do anything we want unless we're prepared to take some quite severe consequences. But just like certainty, I mean, certainty isn't real either. None of us actually have any certainty. We only have the experience of certainty. And this is very similar for autonomy. We can have the experience of being self-determining, and that's what gives us the buzz. So again, it may be quite obvious what kind of triggers there might be, and in the modern workplace, that actually reduce our sense of autonomy. This is a real problem, particularly in organisations that are highly controlling. So if your culture is one where controls and structural clarity is absolutely the most important thing, then you may well have a low level of constant threat around people's autonomy. And the things that really trigger this badly are things like micromanagement and imposed systems and controls, which make people feel trapped inside a big machine that determines what they can and can't do. So things like complicated rules and authorizations, many organizations have in the past, for example, articulated rules around authorization as being limits of authorization, or LOAs. That's quite common in different large organizations around the world. And we're going to talk later about how best to change that so that you don't have these autonomy triggers. Interestingly, increased complicated collaboration is also a threat to autonomy. So when we think about increased collaboration, we tend to think of it as universally a good thing, but actually it's important to understand that when we make a demand on people to do more collaboration, you're also interfering with their potential autonomy, because the very nature of collaboration is that we are giving some of that up in order to work better with others. And I think anything that's kind of secret and then imposed is going to trigger the autonomy problem. Relatedness. Let's have an explore of that. This comes back a bit like status to the fact that we are a large tribe animal. We live in community, we work in community, and we need each other. And when we belong and we feel like we belong and our identity is woven in with others, that releases all sorts of wonderful hormones like oxytocin, which again is an evolved response, because if we're then going to stay in our tribe and be part of it, having empathy and generosity towards each other will actually improve the likelihood of the survival of the whole tribe. So we're kind of evolved to get to seek out that kind of acceptance, and when we find it, to respond with empathy and generosity. What's really interesting with this is that when we don't feel relatedness, when we feel rejected or on risk of rejection, or when our social feeling of safety is diminished, it kicks off reactions in parts of the brain that equate with some very, very powerful sensations. So, for example, people yearn for social safety with the same intensity and in the same part of their brain as the need for food. Now, this is really quite significant if you think about it. And rejection and loneliness actually shows up in the brain images in the same area as does physical pain. So these are really powerful requirements that we have to feel like we're part of a tribe. Modern organisational life, unfortunately, has a very large risk of triggering relatedness problems on an almost constant basis. For many modern organisations, restructuring, for example, is often held up as a tool of first resort as opposed to a tool of last resort when dealing with certain problems. It seems to me that almost any complex problem an organisation is facing, the first thing they want to do is to restructure. And I think that part of that is because people may think that restructuring is a relatively neutral process. Now, we all know from experience it doesn't feel neutral, but we might assume that it's just moving things around on a piece of paper and that people will soon recover. But in fact, destruction and reforming of teams and tribes is extremely damaging and should really only be used when there is no other option available to people. And because, it really interferes with our sense of identity, and it singles out all of those reactions that I was just talking about, which are, food and social safety and rejection and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot less severe things that we can do in an organisation without realising that they're also triggering a relatedness problem. So things like impoverishing our social interactions and skills can have a very serious effect on people's sense of relatedness. But what I mean by that, I beg your pardon, is when you have leaders that focus only on technical or intellectual interaction and don't invest in and support social interaction and social competence with each other. So the richer the social interactions in a group, the more related we'll feel, and the more that calms the brain and allows us to be in this relaxed, generous, innovative state. So emotionally sterile teams are going to struggle with things like creativity and innovation and collaboration. There's also a really interesting relationship here between our sense of capacity to deal with diversity and cultural difference. So when we are suddenly surprised by a rapid increase in diversity or cultural difference, it can interfere with our sense of relatedness. So I think we're seeing some of the unconscious reactions causing quite serious social effects around the world right now of how people can react in a very unresourceful and unthoughtful state to what they perceive as sudden increases in diversity and the breakdown of their own individual cultural patterns. That can be made worse by an effect called broken windows. Now, some of you might be aware of the very famous sort of study in New York when New York was going through its kind of transformation into a modern, vibrant city. One of the things that was invested in various neighborhoods was to clean up and tidy up the environment, the physical environment itself, and to mend broken objects and literally broken windows. And what's interesting, and this has been studied by sociologists many times in different parts of the world, that if we can create a very tidy, clean, functional space with no broken pieces and no broken windows and not dirty and not with stuff piled all over the place, actually that soothes our capacity to be able to handle diversity and cultural difference without it triggering a relatedness problem. So it's worth thinking about when you're working in highly complex environments with lots of diversity, about how you simplify, clean up and invest in making rather beautiful social spaces with limited amount of broken or non-functioning items. So lastly, let's talk about fairness, because this is one of our big triggers as well. And when our fairness need isn't being met, it can actually, it shows up in a very specific part of the brain. And it can literally feel like disgust. So when we witness something that really triggers our fairness response, we may actually literally feel sick in our stomach about it, but the reaction is inside the brain, but it triggers all this stuff in our body, and we can feel a great deal of hostility and anger when our unfairness trigger has been kicked in. This is really important for organisations, because when we feel these kinds of things, we're much more likely to do something that could damage the organisation, like, for example, to sabotage something that's in process, either consciously or unconsciously, to advise a customer to go somewhere else, to leak information to the press or to some other structure. So it's what's called insider threat, and insider threat goes up enormously in environments where fairness is being compromised. And lots of research suggests that when people feel well resourced, they will actually give up some of their personal gain in order to produce just and fair outcomes for the whole organisation. And so this is a really interesting and important part of team performance. Now, of course, we all suffer from unconscious biases and stereotypes, and politics rage through most organisations. And all of these are constantly at risk, at least, of triggering our fairness responses. So again, for leaders and change agents in particular, we need to start to think very carefully about how we work with our unconscious biases, how we ensure that we have people mirroring back to us what we're doing, so that we can understand if we are unconsciously triggering a fairness problem. Some of the obvious things that trigger fairness problems for people are things like inconsistent rule application because of favoritism, and large differentials in privileges which people have or exemptions that they can benefit from. One of the things that we don't always realise, though, is, and it happens a lot in organisations, is where if we witness an individual being punished for something when everybody knows that the problem is systemic. That happens rather a lot. So, for example, an individual might lose a sale, a big proposal, a big bid for something, and either consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly, that person is punished by senior management or by other members of the team for having done that, even when everybody knows that the problem was that your product just isn't the best in the market, or your pricing just isn't good enough, or you were just too slow to get into the game. So these kinds of things are really worth looking out for. Insensitivity to cultural nuance is also experienced as an unfairness, as are cliques and clubs and any kind of exclusivity that means that some people can't join in. Promoting people for political reasons. Now, this happens a lot in big organisations. We kind of say that we're now a values and purpose-based organisation. Values and the how is super important, and yet the people who continue to get promoted are people who seem to fit a world gone by and not be part of what you're actually saying is important anymore. All of these things trigger fairness. Now, one of the interesting things is that in most large organizations, pay and reward package differential has reached almost obscene levels of differentiation. So the number of thousands of percents more that senior people are paid when comparison to average workers has reached a peak in the last few years that many people feel is unsustainable. And one of the reasons it's unsustainable is simply because the bigger this gap grows, the more you're going to trigger these problems, and the more you run the risk of insider threats, lack of innovation, lack of engagement, which means that your business is actually more and more underperforming because your senior people are being paid more and more. I think this is a really big challenge for the comp and ben professionals of the world to start to think about how we judge performance across whole organizations. So this is our SCARF model. Hopefully now you've understood a bit more about what these triggers are, why from an evolution point of view they used to be and still are important to us, and what kind of things in the modern world can trigger those kinds of reactions which hijack the amygdala and throw us into this threatened physical state where our resourcefulness is seriously undermined. So for the last part of this video, I'm going to introduce you to a few ideas for how you can actually be wise about SCARF, how you can lead SCARF wise to enable the more resourceful side of people. So let's have a think about how we can increase people's status experience. We can't always give them higher grades. We can't always give them physically more resources, but we can change the way we organise our workplace and change what we privilege as leaders that can give us a wonderful experience of increased status. So firstly, we can think about learning. When we learn something new, and in particular when we apply that learning and it is proved to be useful to our tribe, if that is noticed and responded to, that elevates our status. So leaders can really help people to elevate their status experience by encouraging learning in the workplace and then noticing when people deploy that learning usefully. This sounds like a no-brainer, but actually is far more challenging than most people think. And if you're listening to this video, I would like you just to sort of think for a moment what sort of percentage of your working life do you spend deliberately in a learning mode as opposed to doing what you already know how to do or going through the motions. And so if you as a leader are only spending a tiny proportion of your time actively and visibly learning and working on your own skill base and competence, then the chances are you're not really releasing your people to do the same. Think about how you measure things. What do you measure? Do you, for example, have a particular metric that's important to you about learning in your community and in your team? Another thing that leaders can learn to do, which is incredibly important, is what we call developing the appreciative eye. Or actually, one could also think of it as this idea of acknowledging and noticing people getting it right. When we mostly as leaders are watching performance, we're kind of naturally predisposed to ignore when things are going well and only respond when things are going wrong. But whether it's with your kids or with your workforce or with each other, training yourself to not notice people in the act of getting something right and then acknowledging it, especially publicly, is an enormous boost to people's status. We can also give access to powerful people and resources. So getting out of the way of our employees interacting directly with powerful people is an enormous boost to their status. Handing over some of our authority and responsibility for serious things like budgets or access to others, and delegating, really properly delegating authority for those things to people, gives people a status boost. And you remember I talked to you about feedback, that old thing of somebody coming up and saying, I'd like to give you some feedback, being the same kind of emotional experience as someone jumping out on you from a blind alley. Well, we do have to give feedback to people, and learning and development is enabled by our ability to hold the mirror up to each other. But the key thing to keep somebody's status high is to make feedback mutual. So whenever you give feedback to somebody, ask them for feedback in return and take it seriously. Because what you're doing is you're basically equalizing your status dynamic. And the other big thing that we can do to support people's status is to try to avoid telling and prescribing to them, and instead develop our coaching and facilitation skills so that we can enable them to make decisions for themselves. So what can we do to increase people's certainty experience? Well, one of the really big things that we can do, which really helps people, is just to be transparent, visible, and to basically keep our promises. So if we say we're going to turn up to a meeting, turn up, be on time, stay the whole time. Don't say you're coming and then leave an hour early, or any of those kind of crazy behaviours that we know that we do. Every time we do them, we break somebody's trust levels and certainty levels with us. When you're planning anything, plan for the maximum level of participation that you think you can get away with. The more people participate, the more they will have a sensation of having some degree of certainty in what they're doing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about paradoxes. The world is full of paradoxes, and most of them are not things that we can eliminate. So, for example, by paradox, I mean that as a leader, you might need to say to your people, I would like you to concentrate on sales now, because unless we sell more XYZ, we're not going to survive. And then at the same time, you might say to your people, I need us to concentrate on innovation and transformation for a future state, because unless we transform, we're not going to survive in the future. Now, this is what we mean by a paradox, because people can't physically be doing two things at the same time, in some cases at least. It creates what feels like an either-or situation. Now, there's a few ways that we can reduce the experience of paradoxes for people. One is that we can help them to find ways of doing effectively both agendas at the same time. So we could find ways of supporting them to make more sales, but as they're making those sales, is to do that in an increasingly transformed or innovative way by reducing the rules, increasing the collaboration, helping people to experiment. So they're both doing selling, but they're also transforming in the same moment. So that takes rather a lot of kind of thoughtful leadership, and certainly includes the reduction of habits, rules and regulations, so that people can experiment. Another way of reducing paradox is to literally get as much out of the system, the paradoxes that are unnecessary. So we were working with a group, for example, who were being told that it was very important that they focus on safety and community building because there had been a couple of fatalities. And this was one of the ways they were restoring and increasing safety levels in the group. But that particular group had to account for every hour of their time. And as they were accounting for every hour of their time on a sort of timesheet, they had various categories that they could account for their time, but the activities associated with safing each other and building community and having conversations about safety had nowhere to go except a box called non-productive time. Now that sets up a mental paradox, because as soon as their non-productive time quota went up and they started putting more in that box, they were actually being punished by leaders for having non-productive time. So that's the kind of paradox that managers can eliminate by thinking about how they might put people in impossible positions because of their current systems and processes. We can increase people's certainty experience by explaining the rationale behind whatever is going on at that moment. So the change management theorists of the 20th century had rather an overblown relationship with the idea of explaining things. The belief was, in terms of traditional change management, that if you explained the why, it would change people's behaviour. And you just had to keep explaining why you wanted them to change. There's actually no evidence for that anywhere in psychology or sociology or in neuroscience. But what explaining why does do for people is it helps to calm down the certainty anxiety. And because it's calming down our certainty trigger, it helps our brain not go into the hijack. It helps us stay resourceful, and therefore we are much more likely to be able to learn new behaviours. So there is a relationship there. So it's definitely worth continuing to explain and explore with people why a certain thing is happening. One of the things that we've done with many of our customers when we're facing very large, complex and uncertain transformation processes is to help them to get used to working in bite-sized chunks, or basically learning to prototype or experiment. Because if we can break down what seems like an impossibly large, amorphous, complex and uncertain project or problem down into smaller iterations of experiments and prototypes with much faster cycles of fail forward, actually not only is that likely to stumble into innovations much quicker and actually be more effective in transformation, it also helps people to calm down their certainty requirements, and therefore they'll be more resourceful, and therefore they're more likely to be able to transform. So this is one of the other reasons we do that in that way. And many of us are faced with situations at work where we are not able to tell people information because of various laws in our countries. What you can always do, and you should always do, is to be clear when that information will be available, and then to keep your promise in terms of making it available. Generally, just intervene less, because every time we intervene, we disturb, and every time we disturb, we cause certainty triggers. So as we look at the autonomy experience, this is where we can start to change quite a lot about our working environment to give people a great autonomy experience. The first thing is to look at all of your regulations and authorizations. If your organization is currently framing them as LOAs, limits on authority, you're missing a trick. Because if you can reframe those as expressing what people have power of authority, as opposed to what their limits of authority are, you're moving them in a forwards direction, so a towards direction, and that's going to trigger an experience of autonomy. So rather than saying don't walk on the grass, we're saying do walk on the pavement or sidewalk. So that's the sort of thing that we need to look out for in our authorization systems. very light, simple structures. And for example, if you're setting up a collaboration team and you know that the fact that it's a collaboration team is going to limit people's experience of autonomy because they have to give up some autonomy in order to collaborate, the first thing you can do is allow that team to come together and to invest in developing its own processes and rules. So if those individuals in the act of coming together can design their own environments, design their own rules, design their own ways of working, even though their requirement to collaborate with each other will go up, their feeling of autonomy will also go up, and that will balance and buffer against the difficulties of working in diverse collaboration teams. But most of all, get a grip on your own desire to micromanage, because imposition and micromanagement is the worst offender in this area. Let's think about relatedness for a moment. What can leaders do to build communities? There is so much that we can do here, and this is where developing your own capacity to be emotionally rich and psychologically aware and socially confident is such a huge part of a leader's development role. If you can create community, stimulate social environments which are emotionally connective, you will create the environment where people can work at a much better level. That can be as simple as things like increasing physicality. Now, I know we have to be super careful about physicality in the workplace. Nobody is going to feel good if somebody pounces on them from nowhere and mashing them into a full contact body hug when that is the last thing that they want. And of course, we have to be super alert to our intentions and exactly what we think we're doing when we physically contact each other. But actually, with sensitivity and with respect and with a genuine interest in building community, teams and organizations that have much higher levels of eye contact, the capacity to hug, to console, to rejoice, to touch in appropriate ways, feel much higher levels of relatedness and are actually capable of doing much better quality work. Simple ways that people can build relatedness are things like making sure they do proper check-ins and check-outs when they're working. And there's actually a huge amount of evidence associated with check-in and check-out in terms of the effect that this can have on people. It actually originated in the airline industry after a major air crash, when the air crash diagnosis came back that the primary reason for the crash, which killed a couple of hundred people, was lack of cockpit empathy and connectedness. So one of the things that this is research has been done many times, and if you can check in very simply about how you're feeling, what's distracting you, what you're bringing into the room, just doing some nice check-ins, and especially at the beginning of bringing a group together, introducing photos, telling stories, sharing emotions, these kinds of things build relatedness capital. And if you think about it, if you can build relatedness capital, which stops you going into the triggered state, keeps you resourceful, then the actual meeting you're about to have is going to be an enormously better quality meeting, and the answers you come up with are going to be better. So there is actually a genuine performance reason for investing in relatedness. And as we mentioned before, restructure is a last resort. But I would suggest that as a leader, you really start to think about, how do I invest in my learning so that I can do this stuff really well? So lastly, fairness. Let's have a look at what leaders can do to increase the fairness quota in people's experience. Well, one of the things we can do is to really practice radical openness and transparency. The more we can share what we know with people, the more we can share the different resources available to us across the people that are working with us, the fairer people will experience things. For example, we talked a little bit in the last section about groups setting their own objectives, values and ways of working, which helps also to buffer autonomy triggers, but it also supports fairness triggers as well, because when a group sets its own ways of working, it can't blame anybody else for being unfair. So our experience of fairness goes up. Obviously, things like inclusion, challenging political favoritism are all important parts of our leadership practice. One of the things we have to get a grip of, though, is that fairness does not mean the same as sameness. So if you literally treat everybody exactly the same, people will actually experience that as being unfair. So we experience fairness not because everyone's being treated the same, but because our intention towards people are the same. Our intention is to be inclusive and to share equally, but that may result in people being treated individually quite differently, because we are all individuals and we like to experience something that's tailored to us. And the key thing is you can't really change others. You can only really change the person in the mirror. And that will give people a strong sense of fairness, because you're taking your own medicine. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this slide as we're in this video, but those of you who are working on a program with us, and indeed if you email me, I can send you this particular thing, and you can produce it as a card and carry it around, or use it as team rules, or do all sorts of things. So please get in touch if you'd like a copy of this. So we're getting towards the end of our video. I'm realising it's quite a long thing to sit through, so I'm hoping you're still with me here. What you may have noticed across all of the 5 SCARF investments that you can make, one thing that sits common across absolutely all of them is about developing yourself as a leader to be able to be facilitative and emotionally rich, moving from a push style of leadership to a pull style of leadership, with rich emotional and social competence underpinning it. And that's why many of our programs focus on developing those particular skills. Lastly, just before I go, I just want to introduce you to one idea that we're not going to cover in any depth here, but might take you on to some other videos that we've produced. When we are confronted with significant change in our organisations, that's often because the organisation itself is under some threat. And our orientation when we find that is often to create what we call a burning platform, or to notice that we are on a burning platform. Now, the idea of burning platform actually was first articulated by a chap called Darrell Connor in 1993, when he wrote a book called Managing at the Speed of Change. And he actually drew on the 1988 Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea, and made what we now understand as being some very inaccurate and unhelpful conclusions about what differentiated those who survived on from the platform disaster and the several hundred people who didn't. Now, it is so entered our common language for change that we now talk about burning platforms without actually really thinking about what this means. Now, I've used this image of Piper Alpha because until you start to understand the notion of burning platform, it's hard to make the connection to the SCARF triggers. But if you think about all of those scarf triggers and what is going on if you are genuinely on a burning platform. I hope it makes sense when I say even talking about a burning platform is most likely to hijack the amygdala, send people into a threat response, and produce precisely the kind of thinking and social behaviour that is the opposite of what is going to actually save your organisation. Now, if you are genuinely on Piper Alpha and it is burning around you, then the fight-flight reaction may well be the best thing for you to have. But our organisations are not in that kind of existential individual threat. It feels like it, but we need to have a much more resourceful reaction. So when we think about change, even in critical transformation moments, we need to think about them in a different way. And the best way we can often create the tension for change is to start to articulate what we're moving towards rather than the burning platform that we have to jump away from. So thinking about a towards orientation does not mean that we are not paying attention to the threats. It doesn't mean that we're in cloud cuckoo land or Pollyanna zone of only talking about what's going well. But I think it is a job of a leader to understand the threats that are facing us in our world and to think about what lies on the other side. So, for example, if we are threatened by reducing customer numbers, instead of creating a burning platform about reducing customer numbers, we can kick off something which is all based on a vision of being the best possible customer experience, or enabling us to be, sort of a passion brand for our customers. Customers as fans was a project we were involved in for a big mobile phone company. And just creating a vision like a fan base of your customers. If we think about what fans will do for their football teams or for their idols, they forgive all sorts of mistakes and errors because they want to be a fan and they're supporting and championing. Now, if our customers could be fans, that would be a very powerful image. So creating a powerful descriptive image of the world you're trying to create, and then inviting people into experimenting forwards into that world, will have a much more powerful effect on their resourcefulness than launching a burning platform of diminishing customers. I hope that sort of gives you a few ideas at least. Now, if you wanted to learn more about this, one of the things you can get into is appreciative inquiry. And most of our customers in the last 20-25 years have been introduced to appreciative inquiry by us because it's such an important part of this work. If you have an interest in appreciative inquiry, there's lots of stuff you can find out about it from either our website or others, including some videos about the basics. So that's it from me. This is a slightly longer video than even I normally produce. This one's running at just under an hour 15, so I hope you've stayed with me. It is quite long. Maybe you've watched it in a few bite-sized chunks, as I recommended. But thank you so much for sticking with us, and I hope you find this useful. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please get in touch, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Good luck.